Hello and welcome to the final video for Unit 3 Development and Learning. This video is all about operant conditioning. By the end of this video, you should be able to answer the following question. How does operant conditioning apply to behavior and mental processes? So let's start out by talking about what operant conditioning is. Operant conditioning is a form of learning where behaviors are influenced by their consequences. Unlike classical conditioning, which focuses on involuntary responses, operant conditioning focuses on voluntary behaviors. The foundation of operant conditioning comes from the law of effect proposed by Edward Thorndike. This law states that behaviors followed by satisfying consequences are more likely to be repeated, while behaviors followed by unpleasant consequences are less likely to occur again. B.F. Skinner expanded on this idea. He developed the concept of reinforcement and punishment. Skinner used devices like the Skinner box, which you can see in this picture, to study how animals learn through consequences. Positive reinforcement encourages behavior by providing rewards, while negative reinforcement involves removing unpleasant stimuli. On the flip side, punishment decreases behavior by introducing negative consequences. One key technique that Skinner developed is shaping. This involves gradually reinforcing behaviors that come closer to the desired target behavior. For example, if you're training a dog to roll over, you're first going to reward it for lying down, then for turning on its side, and then finally for completing the full action. So like we said, operant conditioning involves associating a behavior with a consequence. And there are two different types of operant conditioning. First is reinforcement. Reinforcing a behavior is trying to get that behavior to either continue or to start. So reinforcement involves increasing or starting a behavior. Punishment, on the other hand, is introduced to decrease or to stop a behavior. So when we're talking about reinforcement, oftentimes we'll use arrows, the up arrow for increasing behavior, and punishment is going to use a down arrow to decrease behavior. Some other words that we need to be aware of are positive and negative. In this case, positive and negative do not mean good or bad. In the case of operant conditioning, positive means adding a stimuli or a consequence. Negative means taking away a consequence. So instead of thinking about good or bad, think about the words add or take away. When we are talking about reinforcement, there are different reinforcers that we can use or consequences that we can use. First of all, primary reinforcers are innately reinforcing stimuli. They usually satisfy some biological need like food or drink. Secondary reinforcers, on the other hand, are a learned reinforcer. This secondary reinforcer gets its reinforcing power through its association with a primary reinforcer. For example, grades, praise, smiles of approval, money, and applause are all things that you need to learn are a good thing. Immediate reinforcers are obviously reinforcers that happen very close or immediately after a behavior. Delayed reinforcers, then, are reinforcers that come after a bit of time after that behavior. For example, a paycheck. You don't get your money for working your job immediately after completing the shift. You might have to wait a week or 2 weeks to get your paycheck. So let's look at the different types of reinforcement and punishment. Once again, we need to label our words for what they mean. Reinforcement means increasing behavior. We use that up arrow. Punishment means decreasing behavior. In this case, positive means adding a consequence, and negative means taking away a consequence. So positive reinforcement is going to be adding a desirable consequence to increase behavior. An example of this would be receiving a piece of candy for answering a question in class. Positive punishment then would be adding something undesirable to decrease a behavior. For example, receiving a demerit for breaking the dress code. Negative reinforcement is going to be taking away an undesirable consequence to increase behavior. For example, I'm going to say no homework because everyone in class finished their work on time. This is taking away the consequence of homework in order to increase the behavior of doing your work on time. Negative punishment is taking away something desirable in order to decrease a behavior. For example, taking away your cell phone because you sent inappropriate text messages. Next, we're going to discuss different reinforcement schedules and concepts related to reinforcement in psychology. These are crucial to understand how behaviors are learned and maintained over time. Let's start with continuous reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement is where the person receives a consequence every single time the behavior is exhibited. For example, if a rat presses a lever and gets a food pellet every time, this is continuous reinforcement. This schedule is effective for quickly establishing new behaviors, but it's also more susceptible to extinction if reinforcement stops. Partial reinforcement is when the behavior is only reinforced some of the time, not every time. There are different types of partial reinforcement, which we're going to talk about on the next slide, like fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. Partial reinforcement is more resistant to extinction than continuous reinforcement, meaning that behaviors are more likely to persist when reinforcement is stopped. Reinforcement generalization, very similar to stimulus generalization, is when a behavior is reinforced in one situation and then carried over to other similar situations. For instance, a dog might learn to sit when a trainer gives a specific command. And then it might also sit when given a different command that sounds really similar, like fit. Reinforcement discrimination, on the other hand, is the opposite of generalization. It happens when a subject learns to distinguish between different stimuli and responds only to stimuli that has been reinforced. For example, a dog might learn to sit when hearing the word sit, but not when they hear the word stay or fit. This shows that the dog has discriminated between the two commands. Understanding these concepts helps us explain how behaviors are shaped and maintained. And we're going to look at these different reinforcement schedules in a little bit more detail so we can understand which is the best type of reinforcement schedule to use. So there are some important terms that we need to know and define in order for us to truly understand the different reinforcement schedules. First, the word fixed is going to mean set or constant or the same. The word variable, on the other hand, is going to mean changing or random. Ratio is going to be a consequence happens after a number of behaviors. Interval means that a consequence happens after an amount of time, like minutes, seconds, days, months, or years. So, fixed ratio reinforcement would be receiving a consequence after a set number of behaviors. An example of this might be a punch card at Starbucks or Mama D's. Free coffee after you've purchased 9 coffees. Fixed interval, on the other hand, is going to be receiving a consequence after a set amount of time has passed. For example, your paycheck. You get paid after 2 weeks, no matter how many hours you've worked. That set amount of time of 2 weeks is going to pass before the consequence happens. Variable ratio is going to be receiving a consequence after a random number of behaviors. So a slot machine is a good example of this. If you push a button and you win after a random number of pushes, it doesn't matter how long you sit at the slot machine. It truly matters how often you push that button. Variable interval reinforcement is going to be receiving a consequence after a random amount of time has passed. So an example of this is a pop quiz. You're given a quiz after a random amount of time spent in that class. Here's a graph to represent these different reinforcement schedules. We can see that responses or behavior rates are higher when the consequence is linked to a number of responses rather than time. So ratio is better than interval schedules because we're making the person do the behavior over and over again in order to get the consequence. Responding is more consistent, however, when reinforcement is unpredictable. So variable is better than fixed. So the best type of reinforcement that you can do, the longest lasting and the least resistant to extinction, would be variable ratio. Because variable ratio, the person is never going to know which behavior is going to give them that consequence. So they have to continuously do that behavior until they can get the consequence. This is why slot machines are so addictive, because the person has to continuously push the button until they win. Instinctual drift refers to the tendencies for animals to revert to their natural instinctual behaviors, even after they've been trained using operant conditioning. For example, if a pig has been trained to put coins into a piggy bank, they might start dropping the coin on the floor and moving it around with their snout because they're rooting for food. This is a behavior that's a natural foraging behavior. This happens because the animal's biological instincts can interfere with the learned behavior, making it difficult to maintain the operant response in some situations. So while operant conditioning is powerful, instinctual drift shows that innate behaviors can sometimes override those learned behaviors.